If you've got your Bibles, turn to Luke chapter 9. We'll be reading from verse 46 to 50 tonight, looking at who is the greatest. So Luke chapter 9, we'll be reading through from verse 46 to 50. Now, life is full of paradoxes. There's a great thought experiment called the Bootstrap Paradox. It's the one I'm going to start off with because it's just the most fascinating. So the experiment goes like this. There is a person from the future who uses time travel to go back in time to teach Albert Einstein the theory of relativity. Albert Einstein takes that information, writes his theses, writes his documentation, his stuff, he publishes it and puts it out into the world, of which the time traveler then in the future reads that material, which then he goes back in time to teach Albert Einstein. And so the paradox is, who came up with the theory? Right? Now that's a funny one. But in fact, we don't like paradoxes because they're like, mind blows. But life is actually full of paradoxes. In fact, I can't remember the sociologist, but he talks about left brain and right brain thinking. And he says we live in a left brain world. Left brain world wants low resolution, simple information, reduces everything, no paradox. Right brain thinking says like big picture, and as soon as you start thinking big picture, you think paradox. You have to. That's the nature of life. You want to get rid of poverty, you've got to make rich people richer. It's a paradox, but it's the only way it works. You've got to trust people. Anyway, another one. You are likely to succeed only if you fail. You have to fail to succeed. Life paradox. How about this one? The more you learn, the more you realize how little you know. If you are afraid to fail, you are more likely to fail. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, it's very interesting. Like when you first start playing guitar, this is one of the most annoying ones. Is like you're all concentrating and worrying about making a mistake, and so what do? You make lots of mistakes. So the only way you can get good at something is to not think about it. Just do it. Nike had it on the nose, right? How about this one? The more honest you are with your faults, the more likely people are to think that you're perfect. So the more you confess that you're not perfect, people are like, that guy's really good. Or girl. It's weird. But this is the paradox of life. And we're doing that because at the center of Christianity lies a great paradox. Which is what we're going to look at tonight. Which is if you want to be great, you have to become less. You have to become a servant. This is what Jesus teaches us tonight in the passage in Luke chapter 9, verse 46 to 50. So let's read it. Luke chapter 9, verse 46 to 50. An argument started amongst the disciples as to which one of them would be the greatest. Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took the little child he had standing with him beside him. And then he said to them, "Whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For the one who is the least among you all, he is the greatest." "Master," John said, "we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he's not one of us." "Don't stop him," Jesus said, "for whoever is not against you is for you." May the Lord bless the reading of his word this evening. Now, I love this interaction, particularly in Luke, because unlike Matthew's gospel, Luke follows Mark's emphasis. There's 3 gospels follow this, of welcoming the little children with this conversation of who's the greatest. But what's interesting about Luke, and it's what's going to be our kind of paradox that we're going to look at tonight, is Luke brings out this question of John, of the driving out of demons. And at first it looks like a weird slapping in, like it doesn't fit. But in fact, Luke, through the teachings of Jesus, is trying to show us something that is incredibly complex, in fact, is a paradox that we need to get if we're going to walk this Christian life, if we're going to have any impact on the world. And so what is this paradox? Well, it's pretty simple. Service is greatness. That's the reality. It's not complicated, in fact, of a lesson. Jesus' lesson is, if you want to be great in the kingdom, in His eyes, in God's eyes, serve everyone, be the least. Lesson done, sermon over, go home and sin no more, right? We're done. And you're like, no, it's only been 5 minutes. Come on, Barry. We want our money's worth. No. The problem is, if you just start thinking about this in any practical level, this becomes problematic, doesn't it? Because let's just apply our minds to this. If you're going to be least, there's a passivity that creeps in. That you'll become a doormat to everyone. That you'll be, in fact, manipulated by evil people. And in fact, if you become so least, there is a high tension that you will probably be abused by evil people. And I just need to throw this out there right from the get-go. Christians often are abused because they don't understand the paradox. There's so many scams that creep into churches because we're like, we've got to be the least. We've got to love everyone. And I'm going to ask you, brothers and sisters, God did not ask us to leave our brains at the door when we entered into this room. In fact, Christianity is hard, and we have to think about it, and this is what Jesus is asking us. He's trying to get us to get the paradox. So what is it? Is Jesus asking us to be a doormat person, a passive, just let anything go? No. The service that Jesus calls us to is not doormat passivity. It is actually actively lifting people above yourself. It's actually a total reversal of how we usually treat people. It's making everyone greater than us, which is something we don't do. In fact, growing in our world today, in the 21st century, is what's called transactional friendships. It's a crisis where people are basically in it as long as it works. You know, the contract friendship, cell phone contract. You're in it until someone else offers you a better product. And then suddenly you're on to the next best thing. Marriages work like this. Families are starting to be run like this. Friendships are sadly run like this. I get coffee this week. You better get it next week. We don't want to distable the balance, right? I mean, that's a silly example. But we treat each other tit for tat, don't we? As long as it's working. If you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. Why? Because anything else becomes someone taking advantage of us, right? If you're in a relationship where you are only the one giving, what do we call that? An abusive relationship. Yeah, you're in a relationship with a narcissist. Thank you. You've been abused. But here's the real paradox, and I think this is what we need to think about. Real relationships, real relationships, is the opposite of a tit for tat. In fact, a real relationship is only give. And if I get anything in return, well, that's great. I don't need it. I am here to serve. I'm here to give. In fact, just think about this. Your best friends are what kind of people? The people you really love are the people that will drop anything for you and be there no matter what, right? They're not like, I've got a crisis, come help me up. There better be some pizza in it for me. Right? No, they're like, okay, let's pull together, let's go, let's be there for you. Those are your best friends, right? The ones that won't be like, okay, I'm going to have to owe them for this. And this is the interesting paradox. How do you see those people? You don't see them as less than you. Your friends that are willing to drop anything for you, the people that are truly the greatest in your eyes, are what? The people who will do anything, go anywhere, drop anything for you. In fact, this is what we long for in a partner. When we date and when we get engaged and when we finally get married. I mean, think of the words. For better or for worse. In riches or in poverty, in sickness or in health, forsaking all others to be true to only you, as long as we both shall live. That's not a tit for tat. That is, I'm in this and I'm giving 110% and I expect nothing back. And if someone did that for you, you know what you would see of that person? They'd be the greatest person alive to you. You see the paradox? You see that tension? I think this is most beautifully seen in Jesus' illustration of the child, and the idea of children and greatness. I mean, think about it. The child-parent relationship is the most unequal relationship that you will ever enter into. And yet it's the most rewarding. I mean, if you think that you are going to have a give and take relationship with your child, the first long time, you're in for a bad time, right? I mean, the baby years are going to be real rough, right? For a few couple of months, you're going to get nothing. And then, like, if you're lucky, you get an early bloomer and they smile at you. And you know what they're telling you at that stage? Not like, oh, I love you, I want to give you everything. It's like, you entertain me. I'm happy with this. Now give me food. Right? And then they become teenagers, and it becomes even more complicated because it's now not even like you entertain me. You annoy me. Now give me food. Exactly. Right? And yet you love these rubbishes. You serve them. In fact, your whole desire of a parent is to lift them what? Higher than you. To not let them make the same mistakes you made. There's a paradox there. The parent-child dynamic is one of sacrificing, of giving and serving, and yet Jesus offers that as the mark of greatness. And so sacrificing yourself for another in the eyes of Jesus, church, is the mark of someone who is truly great. Now, we'll get into the source later of how we actually do this, because I'm going to say it's harder than we first believed. But take note of the greatness that Jesus is calling you to. It's not how the world equates greatness. It's a reversal. It's a complete opposite. When we think of great, what do we think? We think of powerful. We think of strong. We think of serving, being served, right? In fact, your whole life is orientated towards this. You are told from the time you get up, start to be aware of yourself. Your parents are like, go out and get. Prove yourself. Make something of yourself, right? And if you don't, you're going to get eaten up. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. But Jesus says no. That's the wrong focus. You want to be great? Lift everyone else up. Live for everyone else. And again, you're looking at this, you're like, this doesn't sound right. This sounds impossible. We need to sacrifice for ourselves. In fact, I think it's harder than that. In Luke's gospel, he says, if you welcome one of these children, you welcome me and the one who sent me. So if you're welcoming, there's a dynamic of Jesus and the Father related into that. There's a dynamic that's going on there. And in fact, the word there for welcome is the Greek word dexatai. Thayer translates this as to receive or to take upon oneself, to sustain, bear, or endure. In other words, you are taking responsibility for what? That child. And if you do that, you're entering into a dynamic with Jesus and the Father. The call in this text, church, is to take on the responsibility of the one who can offer little to nothing in return. That's the mark of greatness. And in fact, it's been pushed even further, because the next line is John. John comes in the midst of this great lesson, and he's like, but Jesus, what about the outsider? And Jesus says we serve him. There's a service of the outsider. I mean, let's think about it. It's an arbitrary connection, right? Jesus, children, greatness, we get that. And suddenly John's like, you know what? I don't like this. let me throw in the question about this other guy who's casting out demons. It's almost like it's arbitrary. It's almost like John's uncomfortable. Just like I saw in this audience, when we started to get serious about the cost of this, everyone's like, okay, move on. Let's talk about something else, right? You are wanting to be like John, which is like, let's talk about demons. Jesus, come on. This is uncomfortable. Let's move on. But in fact, there's a beautiful connection here. And in fact, Jesus, by saying what he says, combines these two realities into a profound single lesson. So let's ask, what's the connection? Well, what is the context of John's question? We've been going through it for tonight. It's about who's the greatest. And so John pipes up in this conversation about who is the greatest, and he says, God, Jesus, no, not God, Jesus, teacher. We saw some guy who's not cool like us. He hasn't given up everything. We're the great. This is the conversation the disciples having. It's the 12, the special. We saw some random dude on the street, and he was casting out Jesus in your name. And you know what, Jesus? I told him to stop. You see how John was trying to let's get back onto this question of greatness. You know who's great? Jesus is me. Because I stopped some random dude that was trying to sneak in the back door to our little group of great guys, right? I stopped him, Jesus. And what does Jesus say? Jesus devastates him. Because he's basically pushing himself forward in like a humble brag. It's literally a humble brag. That's all it is. It's like, Jesus, I'm not trying to say anything about this, but I stopped some guy who was using your name wrong. And Jesus is like, don't stop him. Whoever's not against you is with us. Fundamentally, Jesus' lesson follows after the illustration of the child. You want to be great? Well, the nobody out there who hasn't given up all that you've given up, well, you're all together. You're on the same side. So stop boasting about your position. Notice the contrast here. Notice how we normally function. We love to highlight positions of importance. Right? You get titles and subtitles. It's not just the CEO, it's the assistant to the CEO. And you get bigger and longer, and it gets to the point of absurd. Pastor's not good enough. We need that reverend. Reverend's not good enough. It's now the right reverend. It becomes this mark of what? We're all special, but I'm a little bit more special. We love this. But Jesus is saying that's not what counts. You want to highlight your position. You want to highlight your mark of your greatness. You want to push forward of your accolades and what you've done. You're missing it. You're missing it. Jesus is basically saying, if you want to be great, well, even on the outside, the guy who is not one of the chosen apostles, the guy who's not on the team, the guy who hasn't given up everything, you two are on the same page. You want to be great? You better be serving him. You better be lifting him up to the position you think you are in your own head. It's a complete equalizing of the world. And this is the paradox of Christianity. The greatest in Christianity is the servant. The hero is the one who loses it all. To use Jesus' word, you want to save your life? You better give up on it. And on a practical level, church, I'm going to say, this sounds like great. It's like it preaches, but it doesn't live. We struggle with this, right? Like if you're listening to me actively tonight, you're trying to work this out. Okay, this sounds right. Like it sounds what the passage is saying, but how do I do it? In fact, this counters everything I want, everything I am. We don't get this. Let me illustrate to you. A little illustrative story. It's not highlighting anyone that I know. It really is, but so say you are like a really hardworking student. straight A your entire life. You work harder than anyone else in the entire school. Accolades your entire career. You graduate doing very well. Decide, you know what, I'm going to serve people. I want to become a teacher. And you don't just become a teacher, you become a great teacher. In fact, you finish top of all the humanities. You're the greatest student and teacher, and you go out there. But then, 10 years later, you go to your school reunion. And you bump into someone who you know was the laziest person in your entire grade. They skirted every class. They handed in things late all the time. They scraped through. They partied the hardest. They did nothing. And you find out that they work for one of the top investment firms in the country. They are buying their second home. They currently live in a multi-million rand home, and everything is just gravy for them. How do you think you feel about that? How does your heart, if you put yourself in that position, how would you feel about that, right? What would you think? That's not fair, right? But you chose the career. You went into this profession for what? To serve. But now, in this position of servanthood, you see one person who you know skirted the system, and what do you think? This is not fair. I should get more, right? And that should be how life is, right? Like, the people who serve the most should be looked after the most, but they're not often. They're often pushed aside and abused by the world, right? We get this all the time, church. In fact, in the church, we get this all the time. As a pastor, I can't tell you how many times people come up to me and no one visited me. And my instant response is, like, I don't say this, but I want to. So? Is the church about you? I don't, because, I've learned to control my tongue and I'm growing as a human being. It's not about you, right? But no one's visiting me. No one cares for me. In fact, you know this. You serve, and what do you feel? Like, no one's acknowledging me, right? Like, where's my accolades? We get grumpy, and we throw our little tantrums because no one's noticing us. Do you see how we flip the coin on this? How we get this backwards? And in fact, you know how hard this is? Because who here doesn't want a pat on the back? Who here doesn't want to be acknowledged and rewarded for when they do something? And so the question comes down is, how do we do this? What is the source of greatness? Well, to answer this question, it comes from what Jesus says in verse 48. He says, whoever receives or welcomes, takes responsibility of this little child in my name, receives or welcomes me. And whoever receives or welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For the one who is the least among you is the greatest. Notice the connection, church. The one who receives this little one receives me. The one who welcomes me. This word again, this word dexatai, comes up. The one who takes responsibility to sustain and bear enters into a dynamic of myself, Jesus says, and the Father to take responsibility and bear. And so let's ask the question, how does Jesus take responsibility and bear us? Okay? Isn't he the one who gave up everything for us? Isn't he the one who set aside his royalty, his godness, for the sake of who? The sinner. For us. To put it another way, we serve only because, church, we have been first served. John, in John 1 verse 19 says, we love because he first loved us. In other words, if we want to get this, it's only if we are reflecting what has already been done in us through the gospel. In other words, you can't do this. This is the impossibility of the Christian walk. Jesus is calling us to something that if we tried in our own strength, we are going to be abused. Or we're going to run out of steam. We don't have it within us to actually achieve this. The only way we get this is if we are letting Christ in us do this. If we are reflecting on the cross of the truly great one who came down and died for us, for sinners, for the chief of sinners, and gave it all, as we've been singing. It's a reflection. Who are we, church, that He should do what He did for us? For us. And why did He do it? So He can get something from us? What do we bring back? Let me ask you, what do we come to Jesus with? Our sin. Our brokenness. We're the worst kind of friends. Right? And He did it all for us. He gave it all for us. And as we reflect, church, on this great act of love and this unbelievable act of service to us, the sinners, there we look at others and think, well, I got freely. Surely I can give. Surely I can go a little bit longer, a little bit further, go the extra mile. Surely He gave it for me. When we see, church, to reverse what Jesus said, when we see how deep the Father's love for us is and what Christ has done, there we will receive the least. In other words, we act because we were acted upon. That is Christianity. And in fact, that changes everything. I don't want to take too much of your time, but one more illustration. Promise. I remember, and I share this often when I do my marriage counseling, the one time Natalie and I were fighting, and I was in the right. I know it's rare, but I was in the right. And she wasn't saying sorry. So I'm like, I'm done. And I go to the kitchen, and we didn't live in a big house at that stage. It was a 40 square meter house, so you couldn't really go far. And I angry cleaned up. You know when you angry clean up? Ever done that? Like, I washed dishes, but I washed them like good. And I kept on thinking, you know what? She needs to come to me. I am in the right. I didn't do wrong. She needs to come to me. You know? I am right. And as I'm repeating this in my head and scrubbing, it's like the voice, and it wasn't really, but it was like this, I came to you. I'm like, darn. And as I reflected more upon what Jesus had done to me, I felt less and less right. And I gently put down the plate. And I went off. And I made right. I served. Not because I'm great. In fact, I was trying to show how bad I was. But because of what Christ had done to me and how He annoyingly reminded me in that moment of how much I owe. Just what I'm trying to show you is this is the wonderful transforming power of the gospel. To borrow a phrase that Tim Keller often says, if we get this, the gospel truly changes everything. Imagine how different your relationships would be if this is how you lived out. If you lived this reflective reality of what Christ has done for you. So now with that in mind, church, go and sin no more. God calls us to things way beyond ourselves. But He's done all we need to do it. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you that what you call us to is impossible, but you've given us everything we need. And in fact, we're going to do these things, and we're going to realize that we have no way to boast about them. It's not us, it's you in us. And oh, how you do wonderful things through us. How deep and wide your grace is upon us, that we would be conformed into who you are. Lord, may we be reflectors of the grace that you've already poured out as we, like you, serve the least. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Won't you stand?